Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a couple of questions. Under pressure from the U.S., Russia and Ukraine are finally sitting down and talking. But are the two sides getting closer? And how much is political theatrics? Let's get to the bottom line. U.S. President Donald Trump has made peacemaking between Russia and Ukraine one of his top priorities. But progress has been harder than he thought. Ukrainian leaders say they want their country to exist as an independent, sovereign state. Russian leaders argue that they need territory and other guarantees to make sure Ukraine can't be used as a Western threat against their country. Both sides have agreed to talk to each other to avoid angering the White House, but at the same time, they continue to rain missiles, bombs, and drone attacks on each other. President Trump has accused both sides of intransigence as they escalate the military attacks on each other. So what are the prospects for a real peace deal or even a ceasefire? And what is Russia's vision of success right now? What does it hope to achieve with Ukraine and beyond in the region? Today, we're talking with Angela Stent, former U.S. State Department official and currently the Director Emerita of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies at Georgetown University. And she's author of Putin's World, Russia Against the West and With the Rest. And Andrey Kortunov, the former Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council in Moscow. Thank you both for joining me. Let me start with you, Andrey. You and I have talked before about this conflict. You kind of framed it in a way that sort of looked at this as one of the after effects of the end of the Cold War. I'm interested right now in how you see the tilt of this conflict and Russia's place in the world. What is Russia's vision for itself, and is it winning?
Well, I think that we should not underestimate the centrality of this conflict for the Russian leadership and for Vladimir Putin in person. It is not just another foreign policy issue. It is the foreign policy issue. It's a matter of very high concern, and everything else is subordinated to this key issue. I think the perception is that Russia is winning, maybe not as fast as the Russian leadership has expected, but Russia is prevailing. And ultimately, Ukraine will have to accept most of the Russian conditions for a peace settlement. Moreover, the perception is that the West at large will have to accept the majority of Russian demands on the new European security architecture. It does mean that Vladimir Putin is not ready to negotiate some de-escalation or even ceasefires, but his basic demands remain the same as they were more than 3 years ago.
Do you think, Andrey, that Putin is succeeding in dividing NATO and weakening NATO, or with Sweden joining, with Finland joining, has a lot of what Putin launched backfired when it comes to the security situation as he sees it from Moscow?
Well, I think that it is too early to say that there is a real split within NATO. And I think that there are concerns that Donald Trump at some point might change his mind. He might get tired of this conflict. His patience might run thin. And of course, Donald Trump has to face a lot of pressure, not just from his allies in Europe, but also from the Capitol Hill and maybe even from within his own administration. So there are concerns that Donald Trump might change his position, and the United States will continue to support Ukraine, maybe not at the level at which this support was rendered to Kyiv by the Biden administration, but still the United States might shoulder the Ukrainian military might. However, for the time being, of course, the U.S. administration is perceived as an opportunity, potentially as a game changer, and definitely the Russian leadership is very interested in maintaining positive, constructive relations with Washington, D.C., not just on the Ukrainian issue, but beyond the Ukrainian issue as well. That's why they are so focused on restoring the diplomatic relations with the United States, and they offer some potential economic deals to the United States. The idea is to make sure that it's not just Ukraine, but the political investment portfolio in this relationship will be diversified.
Angela, let me ask you about, from your perspective, and, you've met Vladimir Putin, you've kind of looked at Russia for decades, and I'm just interested as you sort of look at what you think is the grand strategy of Russia towards the West and the rest. Mm-hmm. I don't know, does it seem like they're getting a tilt in their favor right now?
So I think the ultimate grand strategy is to undo the post-Cold War settlement. And President Putin, again, has repeated the fact that he doesn't believe that the breakup of the Soviet Union was legal. It was wrong. And there are people around him who really think that that's their ultimate aim. And if you look at the treaties that they presented to NATO and the United States in December of 2021, they were basically calling for the rollback of NATO to where it was before the first enlargement. So that is certainly the ultimate grand strategy.
You're saying that's the North Star.
That's the North Star. I mean, that's the ultimate grand strategy, is to just roll back the entire post-Cold War settlement. And that's why they're at war with Ukraine now, and that they've been trying to undermine governments in a number of the other post-Soviet states and have more pro-Russian governments there. So that's the ultimate aim. I think the intermediate aim clearly is to subordinate Ukraine, is to have a rump Ukraine to effect regime change there, and a Ukraine that will not look west. Because as we know, as Putin wrote in his 5,000-word essay the summer before the invasion began, he does not consider that Ukrainians are a separate nationality, that Ukraine is a separate country.
He was very overt about what he was going to do and what his intentions were.
I mean,
we kept asking, what's Putin doing? And he wrote it down.
I mean, I published a piece just before the invasion. It was clear to me then, and to a number of other Russia watchers, that this was going to happen, because he didn't disguise his goals there.
You were Russian intelligence officer for the United States, I think in the National Intelligence Council. Essentially for our viewers, that's like the top CIA job, watching Russia. If you were the top Russia watcher for the president of the Czech Republic or Poland or Romania, would you tell them that they ought to be nervous?
I certainly would. I mean, I don't think anything is imminent, but I think we know, again, what the ultimate goals are. So, and I think they are nervous, particularly if you talk about Poland or the Czech Republic, where, there are also acts of sabotage that have been carried out over the European continent in the last years that emanate from Russia. So, yes, they should be nervous.
I often think that offshore perspectives of each other sometimes have offered, a little more glimpse of how the world really sees this. And I'd love to ask Andrey, how, Andrey, do you see Donald Trump right now? How do you see the United States? Do you see the United States as a formidable rival and adversary? Do you see the United States as a burgeoning new friend? Do you see Donald Trump as a buddy of Vladimir Putin? From your perspective, what are the dimensions, particularly in a strategic frame, of how you see the U.S. from Moscow today?
If I might just very briefly comment on what Angela has just said. If you look at the current situation from the Kremlin, you would argue that the Russian foreign policy has never been revisionist, but has always been defensive. The message from the Kremlin is that from the very outset, after the disintegration of the Soviet Union, Russia tried to get integrated into the Western community of nations. We tried to be nice and to basically respect all the interests of the Western community. However, we were denied this access. We were not treated as an equal partner. And basically, what we do is just a reaction to the perceived aggression from the West, to the NATO enlargement, to the interference of the United States and its European allies into domestic affairs of the Russian Federation, so on and so forth. So from the viewpoint of the Russian leadership, it's not a revisionist strategy, but it's an attempt to maintain the status quo and to defend this natural, quote-unquote, sphere of influence that Russia is entitled to as a great power. But speaking of Donald Trump, responding to your question, I think that there is a clear understanding in Moscow that the anti-Russian consensus remains very strong and very broad in the United States, and it's just a political will of a single person which triggered these positive changes in the relationship. So the question is whether Moscow can build on this political will something that would have a lasting impact on the relationship beyond the Trump administration, or whether indeed diplomatic relations can be restored, whether we can see some sanctions lifted or amended, whether we can see new economic projects, whether Russia and the United States can cooperate on regional issues. So this is the challenge, and I think there is full understanding that there is not much time to make things moving, and that this phenomenon of Trump may be a passing one.
Let me just ask you go a step further. There are reports now, Andrey, that the Ukraine conflict has now cost upwards of close to 1 million lives on the Russian side of the equation. I don't know the Ukrainian side, but I imagine that's an awful number too. Is that felt? Is the sort of the ulcer of this, the trauma of this felt in Russian society?
Well, we don't know the exact statistics. There has been no official information on the losses on the Russian side. We can imagine that these losses are significant. But if you go downtown Moscow, you will not probably see many changes that took place over the last 3 years. Moscow is still a vibrant city. It is, restaurants are full over weekends. There are traffic jams. Of course, some foreign companies left the city, but it's not that visible. So I think that what the Russian leadership was able to do is to somehow separate the society from this war. People who are fighting in trenches are mostly people who signed contracts and who have quite lucrative monetary remuneration for their services. So it's not that visible. Of course, from time to time, you can see veterans of this war, and you can see some crippled people, but not too many. So I would venture to say that at least here in this city, the signs of a war are not that explicit as one could think they should be.
Angela, I'd love to ask you the same question about looking at the United States and U.S. policy now. I'm interested in how you see it, because I think what Andrey just said is very interesting, that Donald Trump is a single individual. He's not yet the system. But I'm interested in whether you see systemically the United States beginning to move towards Russia in a much more cooperative, positive way and beginning to reject its classic traditional allies.
So I think that this country is very divided over that. Let me also just go back to what Andrey said before, and that is I would agree that the West was unable, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, to create a post-war, post-Cold War European security architecture in which Russia had a stake. And so we're now dealing with the consequences of this.
But some people wanted to do that. Richard Haass was head of policy planning, told me he wanted Russia to have a track into NATO.
Right. Well, so I worked on policy planning with Richard Haass, and we wrote a memo describing how one would approach Russia if it wanted to join NATO. So yes, I mean, even at that point...
Did we ever even put it on the table with Russia? Because aren't you, if Russia weren't going to be in NATO, weren't you going to end up at some point back to an us versus them situation?
Yeah, so that memo never went anywhere, but we did work on it. So, I think Donald Trump, to some extent, is different from all of his U.S. predecessors since the end of the Cold War, and that is unlike the predecessors who tried to reset relations with Russia, and none of that never worked because they had such a fundamentally different idea of the drivers of global politics than Russia did. I think Donald Trump shares many of the same views as Vladimir Putin in terms of the drivers of world politics, the acceptability of having spheres of influence, not interfering in the domestic affairs of other countries. But I think I think this view represents a minority of Americans. It certainly does if you look at the Congress, if you look at the Russia watchers. We're split, obviously, and I think even within the Trump administration, there are different views of that. But to me, that's what's so remarkable about this, is that you do have a U.S. president who in many ways shares also the skepticism about allies. I think that's the same for President Putin and those around him. So you have a convergence of views, I think, which you've never had, at least since the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Look, the Henry Kissinger rule was you're either in bed with China or you're in bed with Russia, but never in bed with both. Now we're in bed with neither from a U.S. perspective. Yeah. And I've heard a lot of people talk about the structural integration and the deep bonds that are growing between Russia and China. That wasn't supposed to happen. Yeah. Do you buy that, and are you worried about it?
Yes. So I think the idea of some in the Trump administration that if you improve ties to Russia, you have a successful reset, Russia will distance itself from China, I think that's a total illusion. I mean, I think the Russian-Chinese relationship gets closer and closer. China obviously is supporting Russia in its war against Ukraine, and I think both leaders understand that this is a long-term relationship, and certainly the Chinese don't want regime change in Russia. They don't want Russia to lose the war with Ukraine. So I think we have to accept the fact that going forward, and they both believe that we're at the dawn of a new world order, and that they will be the dominating powers there, maybe with the United States. So, Russia is very dependent on China economically and in terms of its energy sales and things like that. But I think that those are the choices that the Russian political establishment has made.
Now, Andrey, do you see a deepening of purpose and cause and friendship with China as one of the new features of the global strategy right now?
I would agree with Angela, but I would make a footnote. I think that there are certain quote-unquote objective limits for this cooperation. I don't think that Russia and China will ever join a political or military alliance. I think the two nations will have disagreements over a number of important foreign policy matters. For example, Russia and China are not likely to agree completely on India. They have very different perspectives on this country. I think that even if you take Ukraine, I would be surprised to see China formally recognizing the appropriation of former Ukrainian territories by the Russian Federation. I think they are concerned in Beijing about their own separatism, and that has an impact on how they approach the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. I think that Russia and China might even compete in certain areas. So I think that there are certain limitations to this relationship. But on the other hand, these are two relatively big nations, and they have a long common border. There is a natural complementarity between their economies. So even without the United States, they would have worked with each other, and we would have seen close partnership between Moscow and Beijing. On top of that, of course, we should keep in mind that there is a strong personal chemistry between Vladimir Putin and President Xi Jinping. So that is also something that has an impact on the bilateral relations. Both men have invested a lot of their own political capital in this relationship, and this is going to last.
People are used to seeing Donald Trump be such, buddies with Putin at some level. The story is very different when it comes to Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, with whom Donald Trump has been really, really tough, very, very short and abrupt, and critical oftentimes, and kept saying Ukraine has no cards. It has no cards. Russia has the cards. Well, a card got played recently, Operation Spiderweb. I guess, is there in this moment where both sides are muscling up with each other an opportunity for pause that we could actually get something that could lead to some sort of resolution or peace or a sustainable equilibrium?
Well, I think that we can only hope that the current escalation might ultimately lead to de-escalation and to some kind of a peace settlement. But I'm afraid that under the current circumstances, both sides are ready to go further in escalating the conflict, because Putin already stated that we have to respond to the Ukrainian act. And definitely this response has to be impressive. It's also clear that Ukraine will continue to practice what we can call asymmetrical responses to the Russian advancement along the line of contact. Since Ukraine is weak militarily, they have to look for some unorthodox way to make their case. So I think that though some de-escalation should not be ruled out, but since there is no trust between the two sides, we face the danger of further escalation. And this is something that we will see emerging maybe within the next couple of days or within the next couple of weeks. Let us only hope that this cycle of escalation will be a short one.
Angela, let me ask you about what you think about Operation Spiderweb, but also want to ask you something else, which is really the impotence of collective action against Russia. It seems to me, Europe is now moving its 18th set of measures sanctioning Russia and various 18 times. The U.S. government has, Donald Trump has asked the Congress to pause for a moment, also considering more sanctions on Russia. But as Andrey just said, it's hard to see that this is having any impact. Moscow's found, the economy's growing. It seems to be riding the saddle well. What do you see as the failing of the West in curtailing or directing Russia's course?
So I think, the sanctions have affected Russia. I mean, they're on a war footing economy now. They have inflation is great. There are shortages of things in stores, maybe not in Moscow, but in other places. And most economists think that next year it'll have a greater impact on Russia. But one of the reasons why the sanctions haven't worked is there's a huge amount of sanctions evasion. And of course, if the Congress were to pass this new sanctions bill, there'd be 500% tariffs on countries that are purchasing Russian oil. Why has collective action failed? Because I do not believe that President Putin has really believed that there would be a major pushback militarily against him. And that's really the argument. And so I think the only other argument would be if there was, the West redoubles its attempts and its commitment to arm Ukraine and support it during this war. But otherwise, it hasn't worked.
Yes or no, do you think a durable peace deal is possible in the next 6 months?
No.
Andrey, yes or no, do you think a durable peace deal is possible in the next 6 months?
Not a durable peace deal. No. Something less than that.
So on that optimistic note, we're going to have to bring this to a close. Wonderful conversation. Georgetown University professor Angela Stent and former director of the Russian International Affairs Council, Andrey Kortunov, thank you so much for joining us today. So what's the bottom line? The key thing here to understand is that Russia is playing a long game. And with so many lives lost, the costs of this game are really high. Russian President Vladimir Putin sees this as an acceptable cost to secure Russia's border security. But it also means that Ukraine is probably not the extent of his ambitions, and that the larger conflict in Eastern Europe is never ending, even if a peace treaty were to be miraculously secured. Ukraine is fighting for its sovereignty and its people and its national ambitions to be part of Europe. So it, too, is playing a long game. And Europe, it sees itself on the line and is playing a long game, too. But the United States, a key player, is the only one here playing a short game. It wants out, particularly under President Donald Trump. And America's departure, which I feel is really inevitable, contributes to the volatility of this moment and to the high stakes for Ukraine now. And that's the bottom line.